Town burned criminal into her skin. A lone hunter trapped the real thief and dragged out the truth. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. In the quiet, dust-filled town of Lincoln Springs, where life moved slowly and secrets were buried just as deeply as the well-worn paths, a young woman named Eleanor Harris was dragged into the heart of the most brutal injustice the town had seen in years. Eleanor, with her wide eyes and gentle nature, had never been part of the rough-and-tumble world of the frontier, but fate had a cruel way of thrusting the innocent into the fires of suspicion. It was a hot, late summer day when Eleanor first crossed paths with disaster. She had been working in the town's bakery when a theft was discovered at the local bank. It wasn't just any theft. A large sum of money had been stolen, and the bank's vault was completely emptied. The town was in an uproar, but the sheriff, a man named Ray Collins, was quick to act. His eyes, as cold and calculating as the steel of his gun, scanned the room, landing on Eleanor. The town had always whispered about her. An outsider, alone, with no family to back her, no one to vouch for her. It was too easy to blame her. She had been near the bank that morning, delivering bread to the town's tavern. The rumors started fast, spreading like wildfire through the streets. She was there. She must have done it. No one in the town was willing to stand up for her. Her reputation was tarnished before she even had the chance to speak. The sheriff wasted no time. In a brutal show of power, he had her dragged to the center of the square, where a crowd had gathered. Her hands were bound, her face red with the shame of the accusations, and the town stood around her like a mob ready to pounce. "You've got the look of a criminal," Sheriff Collins sneered as he approached, his eyes narrowing. "A thief who's been hiding in plain sight." In front of the entire town, he ordered her to be branded. The mark would remain on her skin forever, a sign that she was the criminal they needed her to be. The hot iron was pressed against her flesh, and Eleanor cried out, the pain searing through her, but no one came to her aid. The crowd stood silently, some watching with satisfaction, others with guilt-ridden faces, but none brave enough to challenge the sheriff. Eleanor was left to bleed and suffer under the weight of her new, branded identity. As she stumbled away from the crowd, broken and humiliated, there was one man who didn't look away. A lone hunter, John Calloway, had been watching the scene unfold from a distance. His reputation in the nearby hills had been earned through silence and precision, and he had no love for injustice. When he saw Eleanor's face, he saw not a criminal, but a victim. He couldn't explain it, but something in her eyes sparked a memory, the kind of memory that told him she was innocent, and that the truth was out there, buried beneath lies. He wasn't sure how or why, but he knew he couldn't let the truth die with her. He would find the real thief, no matter what it took. Eleanor stumbled away from the crowd, her body weak and trembling from the searing pain of the brand on her skin. The sun beat down, relentless as ever, but it felt like the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. She had been humiliated in front of everyone she had ever known, and in that moment, the entire town seemed like a distant memory. She had no home now, no place to go, just a mark on her body that screamed criminal to anyone who cared to look. The cruel laughter of the crowd echoed in her ears as she limped through the dirt roads of Lincoln Springs, avoiding the eyes of those who had once been neighbors. No one offered help. No one spoke a word of comfort. Her life had been shattered in an instant. But there, in the distance, standing under the shadow of the town's weathered oak tree, was a man who watched her with something different in his eyes. John Calloway, the lone hunter, the one man who had seen the injustice unfold and refused to look away. He was a stranger to the town, a man with a past cloaked in mystery and a reputation built on silence and solitude. His presence had been nothing more than a distant memory to the townsfolk until now. He had seen Eleanor's suffering from afar, and something about the way she held herself, her quiet defiance, her pain, had struck a chord in him. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't let her face the world alone, not after what had been done to her. As she walked past the tree, her steps slow and deliberate, John called out to her in a low voice, barely above a whisper. Miss Harris. Eleanor froze, her heart racing. She didn't turn to face him at first, but then she felt his gaze on her, the weight of his eyes following her every movement. She had no idea who he was, but somehow, his presence felt different from the rest of the men in the town. You're not alone, he said, his voice steady. I know what they did to you. Eleanor turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes tired from the weight of everything that had happened. What do you want? She asked, her voice barely a murmur. I'm not looking for trouble, ma'am. I just want to help, he said, his eyes softening with a hint of something unspoken. He took a step closer, but not too close, as if respecting the invisible boundary that she had built between herself and the world. I believe you didn't do what they said. She took a hesitant step back, the pain from her branded skin still sharp against the back of her mind. She was afraid to trust anyone now, especially a stranger, no matter how kind his words seemed. Why should I believe you? She asked, the skepticism clear in her voice. John paused for a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. Because I know what it feels like to be blamed for something you didn't do, he said quietly, his tone low but filled with sincerity. Eleanor looked down at the ground, her mind racing. The past few days had been nothing but a blur of pain, humiliation, and fear. She had been cast aside, discarded like a criminal by the people she once called neighbors. The idea of someone believing her, truly believing her, seemed almost too good to be true. But then, she saw something in John's eyes. Something that told her he wasn't like the others. You don't owe me anything, Miss Harris, he continued. But I can help you clear your name. I know who the real thief is, and I'm going to find them. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for someone, anyone, to prove her innocence, but she had never expected it from a man like this. How can you help me? She whispered, her voice trembling. I've been tracking the real thief. I know where he's hiding, John said, his eyes now filled with determination. But I need your help to bring him to justice. Together, we can make them see the truth. Eleanor stood there, her mind swirling with a mix of fear and hope. She had no idea who this man was or how he planned to catch the real thief, but in that moment, she realized she had nothing left to lose. She couldn't go back to the life she had before. But maybe, just maybe, she could start over. What do I need to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, his expression serious. I'll show you where he's hiding, but we'll need to move fast. We don't have much time before he realizes we're onto him. Are you ready? Eleanor looked at him, the weight of the world still pressing down on her shoulders, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady now. Let's bring him to justice. And with that, the two of them turned, walking away from the town that had betrayed her, heading toward the unknown, toward the truth that would set her free. As Eleanor and John ventured further into the woods, the weight of the journey began to settle in. The dense forest around them seemed to close in, and the silence was broken only by the crunching of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. Eleanor felt the sting of the brand on her skin with every step, but there was something else stirring inside her, an unfamiliar sense of hope. For the first time in days, she wasn't completely alone. John walked beside her, not as a stranger, but as someone who was determined to help her right the wrongs done to her. The journey to track down the real thief was one of risk and uncertainty, but Eleanor felt a strange comfort in knowing that she wasn't walking this path by herself. They had been traveling for hours, and as dusk began to settle in, John stopped suddenly. He held up a hand to signal for her to stop as well. His sharp eyes scanned the surrounding area, his instincts on high alert. Eleanor, not used to the quiet intensity of the wilderness, stood still, her breath held as she tried to understand what he was sensing. We're getting close, John whispered, his voice low and steady. Keep your head down. Stay close. Eleanor nodded, her heart racing. She had no idea where this road would lead, but she trusted him. They had spent the past day and a half tracking the thief's movements, using the little bits of information they had gathered from the townsfolk and the sparse signs left behind in the wilderness. John had an uncanny ability to read the land, something Eleanor had never experienced before. As they moved forward, John's pace quickened, and Eleanor struggled to keep up. She was no stranger to hard work, but her body was still recovering from the trauma of the branding, and the constant movement was beginning to take its toll. "Are you all right?" John asked, his voice soft but concerned. Eleanor gave him a tired smile, though she could feel the exhaustion creeping into her bones. "I'll be fine," she replied. "Just keep going." They walked for another hour, the light fading and the air growing colder. Eventually, John came to a stop. They had reached a clearing, and before them stood an old cabin, its wooden walls weathered by time. It looked abandoned, but Eleanor could feel the tension in John's stance, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. "This is it," he muttered. "The thief's hideout." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had been so focused on getting to this point that she hadn't fully considered what would happen when they arrived. This was the moment where everything would change, where she would either find the answers she desperately needed or face more danger. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John motioned for her to stay low and stay quiet. "We wait. I'll go in first. You stay out here, hidden. If anything goes wrong, I need you to run." Eleanor didn't like the sound of that. The last thing she wanted was to be left behind, to be forced into a situation where she couldn't help. But she knew John was right. He had more experience with this than she did. "I understand," she said, her voice tight. "Be careful." John gave her a small nod before disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding in her chest as she stood in the cold darkness. She had no idea how long she stood there, minutes or hours, but it felt like an eternity. The silence was unbearable, and her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What if John was caught? What if this was a trap? What if they never found the truth? She gripped the hilt of a small knife John had given her for protection, its cold metal reassuring against her palm. She wasn't a fighter, but she knew she had to be ready for anything. Then, she heard a noise. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. Footsteps. Someone was approaching the clearing. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly ducked behind a large tree, her breath held. She had no idea who it was, but she couldn't take any chances. The figure came into view, a man dressed in dark clothes, moving swiftly through the woods. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Could this be the thief? Or was it someone else, someone who could help? The man walked toward the cabin, pausing just before the door. Eleanor's grip on the knife tightened. She had to know what was going on. Just as she was about to move forward, a voice called out. "Stop right there." It was John. Eleanor's heart leapt with relief, but it was quickly replaced with anxiety as she saw him step out from behind a tree, his gun raised. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice rough and wary. John's eyes never left him. "I'm here to put an end to your little scheme," he said coldly. "You've been stealing from the townsfolk. Long enough." The man laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "You and what army?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the moment that would decide everything. John's voice remained steady, unwavering, as he kept his gun trained on the man before him. The man, however, was unfazed, his lips curling into a smirk. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she felt the weight of the moment press down on her. Her life had been turned upside down, and now, here she was, standing on the edge of justice, of truth, with everything hanging in the balance. The man's hand slowly reached for his belt, and Eleanor instinctively tightened her grip on the knife. John's eyes flashed, his body tensing, but he didn't move. "You've made a mistake, stranger," the man said, his voice thick with mockery. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down? I run this town's business, not you." "Not anymore," John replied coldly, his gaze hardening. "You're done." The man's expression darkened, his hand gripping the knife at his belt. The air seemed to thicken with tension, the slightest movement enough to ignite an explosion. But just as the man's fingers brushed the handle of his weapon, Eleanor heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The unmistakable click of a hammer being pulled back. John's eyes never left the man's, and the gun stayed aimed at his chest. "Make one wrong move, and it's over for you," John warned. The man's eyes flicked to the gun, then to John's face, a mix of anger and fear crossing his features. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of the standoff hanging in the air. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she could hear her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to do something, Anything, but her legs were frozen, her body too numb with fear to act. The man finally let out a slow breath, his hand dropping back to his side. Fine, he spat. But know this, you've only delayed the inevitable. You think you can stand up to me? You're wrong. I've got power and I always get what I want. You're going to prison, John said, his voice low and determined. And when they find out what you've done, you'll never see the light of day again. The man scoffed, shaking his head. You think you can stop me? You've only scratched the surface. There's more going on here than you know. You don't know the half of it. John's eyes narrowed, and Eleanor felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What do you mean? She asked, stepping forward slightly, her voice trembling. The man didn't look at her. Instead, he turned toward the cabin door, a dark smile on his lips. You'll find out soon enough, he muttered, and then, before either of them could react, he darted into the shadows, disappearing into the darkened interior of the cabin. John cursed under his breath and motioned for Eleanor to stay close. Don't let your guard down, he warned as they moved toward the cabin. The door creaked open with a faint groan, and they slipped inside, the cold darkness swallowing them whole. The interior of the cabin was sparsely furnished, with only a small table, a few chairs, and a worn-out rug in the center. But it was the dim corner of the room that caught their attention. A faint light flickered from an oil lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. He's not here, John muttered, scanning the room. Eleanor's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. It was too quiet, too still. Where is he? She whispered, her voice barely audible. John didn't answer at first. His gaze swept over the room one more time before he motioned for her to follow him. Stay close, he said. They moved silently through the cabin, John leading the way. As they reached the far side, Eleanor's eyes landed on something that made her blood run cold. A wooden chest, battered and old, sat near the corner of the room, and beside it, barely visible in the low light, was a stack of papers, covered in what looked like dried blood. Eleanor's heart sank. What is this? She whispered, stepping forward cautiously. John's expression darkened as he knelt beside the chest. Whatever this is, it's bigger than we thought, he said, his voice tight. This is the real reason he's been hiding out here. This is what he's been protecting. Eleanor could barely breathe as she crouched beside him. The papers were covered in symbols, strange markings she didn't understand. But what she did understand was that they were connected to the thief, to the man who had tried to ruin her life. This isn't just a simple robbery, John said, his voice grim. This goes much deeper than that. And we're going to uncover it all. Before Eleanor could respond, a noise interrupted them. A faint creak from behind the door. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. John's eyes shot up, his hand reaching for the gun at his side. The door slowly creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the light. It was the man. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two more figures, their faces hidden by shadows. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The real battle had just begun. The door creaked open wider, and the figure stepped into the dim light, revealing the man who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. His eyes gleamed with cold malice, and behind him, two more figures emerged. Eleanor's heart raced as her mind raced to process the situation. She had thought they were alone in this fight, but now it seemed like they had just walked into the belly of the beast. John's hand tightened around his gun, his eyes scanning the new arrivals with a calculated calm. The man at the front, the one who had been so confident earlier, now seemed to be brimming with a dangerous arrogance. I should have known you'd find your way in here, the man said, his voice dripping with venom. But it doesn't matter now. You're too late. There's nothing you can do. John's jaw tightened, his gun still aimed at the man. I'm not here to make threats. I'm here to stop you. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The situation had just escalated, and now they were outnumbered and trapped in this cabin. But she couldn't afford to panic. Not now. She glanced at the two figures standing behind the man. They were taller, broader, and their posture spoke of hardened men who had seen their share of violence. The odds weren't in their favor, but Eleanor wasn't ready to give up just yet. What's all this about? Eleanor demanded, stepping forward despite the fear gnawing at her insides. What are you really doing here? The man smirked. You're not as naive as I thought, he sneered. This isn't just about one stolen fortune. It's bigger than you can imagine. You've only seen the surface. You think I'm just a thief? No, I'm far more than that. John's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer. I don't care what you think you are. You're still going to answer for what you've done. All of it. The man's expression shifted for a moment, a flash of something almost like fear crossing his face before he regained his composure. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he spat. And you never will. At that moment, one of the figures behind him stepped forward, their hands raised in a gesture that suggested they meant no harm. You don't understand. We didn't want this fight. This wasn't the plan. The voice came from a woman. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected to see a woman among them. She was tall, with short dark hair and a hardened expression that spoke of experience. And what's your role in all of this? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear pulsing through her veins. The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking to the man at the front before she spoke again. I didn't want to get involved, but I was forced into this. We all were. John's attention shifted toward her. Forced? Who's pulling the strings here? The woman didn't answer immediately. Her eyes dropped to the ground, and Eleanor could sense a deep hesitation. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. It's the town. They were the ones who hired us. They wanted someone to cover up their secrets, and we were just the tools to do it. Eleanor's mind spun. The town? The very place she had grown up in. The place where she had been betrayed and branded as a criminal? You're telling me the town was involved in all this? She asked incredulously. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. They didn't want you to find out. They had too much to lose. They needed someone to take the fall, and you were perfect. The revelation hit Eleanor like a ton of bricks. The truth she had been desperately searching for had been in front of her the whole time, buried beneath layers of lies and deception. The very people she had once trusted, the people she had once called neighbors, had been behind the theft, the branding, everything. John took a step forward, his gun still trained on the man at the front. So what now? He asked, his voice cold. Now, we make them pay, the woman said, her voice suddenly fierce. We're not their puppets anymore. If we're going to go down, we're going to take them with us. There was a long silence as the gravity of her words hung in the air. John's gaze shifted from the woman to the two men behind her. He lowered his gun slightly, but his posture remained tense. You're asking us to take on the entire town, he said, a bitter edge to his voice. Do you know what you're asking for? The woman didn't flinch. I know what I'm asking, she said firmly. We can't just walk away from this. They've already destroyed everything we had. We can't let them destroy anyone else. Eleanor's heart beat faster as she processed everything. She had thought the truth was just about clearing her name, but now she realized it was so much more. This wasn't just about one stolen fortune. It was about the entire town, its dark secrets, and the people who had been hiding them for so long. And now, it was up to them to expose the truth. John turned to Eleanor, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then he spoke quietly. Are you ready for this? Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. She had already lost everything. Now, it was time to take back what was rightfully hers, and to make sure the truth came to light, no matter the cost. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady and resolute. With that, the real fight began. The night was thick with tension as John, Eleanor, and the woman, whose name was Sarah, prepared to face the town's dark secrets. The cabin was quiet now, the three of them standing in the center of the room surrounded by the stolen papers and the silent weight of what they were about to do. Eleanor's mind raced as she stared at the documents scattered on the floor, knowing that whatever came next, there was no turning back. The town, the people she had grown up with, the people she had trusted, had been lying to her all along. They had used her as a scapegoat, and now it was time to bring their sins into the light. Sarah stood by the window, watching the last light of the setting sun fade into the horizon. We have to move fast, she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. The longer we wait, the more chance they have to cover up their tracks. We can't let them get away with this. John nodded, his eyes scanning the cabin one last time. We need to go to the sheriff. He's the key to everything. He's the one who made sure Eleanor was blamed for something she didn't do. If we can prove what he's been hiding, everything else will fall into place. Eleanor felt a cold chill at the mention of the sheriff. The same man who had condemned her without a second thought. The same man who had led the town in its unjust treatment of her. She didn't want to face him again, but she knew that it had to be done. They needed to expose the truth, no matter the cost. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "Once we go to the sheriff, there's no going back. They'll know we're onto them." John turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm sure. We have no choice. The truth has to come out. We'll make sure they pay for what they've done, and we'll make sure you're cleared of everything they've blamed you for." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. "We're in this together. You don't have to face them alone anymore." The words were simple, but they hit Eleanor like a wave of relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she had a team behind her. People who believed in her. People who were willing to fight for what was right. As they made their way out of the cabin, the night grew darker, and the air grew colder. They moved quickly through the woods, making their way toward the town without speaking much. Eleanor's mind kept returning to the sheriff, to the man who had condemned her with nothing more than a passing glance. She thought of how he had used his power, how he had let the town turn against her without so much as a second thought. She thought of how he had stood by as she was branded a criminal, without lifting a finger to help her. But now, as they neared the town, her fear began to shift to something else, something sharper. The truth. It was coming. The sheriff wouldn't be able to run from it anymore. The three of them entered the town quietly, under the cover of darkness, avoiding the main streets. John led the way, his movements swift and purposeful, with Sarah close behind. Eleanor followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The air seemed thick with anticipation, every step bringing them closer to the confrontation they had been building toward for so long. They reached the sheriff's office, a small, weathered building tucked away on the edge of town. The light inside flickered dimly, casting shadows across the wooden walls. John signaled for them to stop. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll go in first. You two stay hidden." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. She wanted to do more. She wanted to walk in there and demand answers. But she knew that John had the experience. He knew what needed to be done. She could only trust him now. As John slipped through the door of the sheriff's office, Eleanor and Sarah waited in the dark, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Eleanor could hear the faint sound of voices inside, but she couldn't make out the words. She clenched her fists, the anger and fear from all the days of humiliation bubbling up inside her. She had been wronged. She had been made a scapegoat. But now, they were about to make sure that everyone would know the truth. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Eleanor's patience was tested, her thoughts constantly shifting between the sheriff and the truth that had been hidden for so long. She could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to suffocate her, but she knew they couldn't afford to be careless now. Finally, the door creaked open, and John emerged from the shadows, his face serious but resolute. "It's time," he said quietly. Eleanor's heart leapt in her chest as they moved toward the door, their footsteps steady and determined. The truth was about to come out. The sheriff and the people who had lied to her would have to face the consequences of their actions. And no matter what, Eleanor was no longer alone. She had a voice now, and she was going to make sure it was heard. The sheriff's office was eerily quiet as John, Eleanor, and Sarah stood in the dark shadows just outside the door. Eleanor's heart was pounding so loudly she feared the sheriff could hear it. She wanted to burst through the door, to confront the man who had ruined her life. But she knew they had to be careful. The sheriff wasn't a fool. He had connections, influence, and power, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. John had given her a reassuring look when he went inside, but now that he was gone, that comfort seemed distant. She was about to walk into the lion's den with everything at stake. They had one shot at this. A sudden creak from within the sheriff's office made Eleanor flinch, and she immediately pressed herself deeper into the shadows. Her mind raced. Was John in trouble? Had they been caught? Then she heard a familiar voice. "It's done. Let's go," John whispered, his tone low but urgent. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded silently, and together they moved quickly toward the office door. John opened it just enough to let them slip inside, and they all stood there for a moment, adjusting to the dim light inside. The sheriff's office was small, cluttered with paperwork and old maps. A single lantern flickered on a desk, casting shadows that danced along the wooden walls. Behind the desk sat Sheriff Ray Collins, his back to them, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've been a busy man," John said, his voice cutting through the silence. The sheriff didn't flinch. He slowly turned his chair to face them, his cold blue eyes locking onto Eleanor's. "I've been doing what I had to do to keep this town running," the sheriff said, his voice smooth, like he was explaining something simple. "You wouldn't understand." Eleanor's anger flared. She wanted to scream, to let all the hurt and injustice out in one explosive moment, but she held herself in check. She had to focus. She had to get the truth out, no matter the cost. "You ruined my life," Eleanor said, her voice shaky but determined. "You blamed me for something I didn't do, and you let this town believe I was a criminal. You used me as a scapegoat to cover up your own mess." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You think you know what happened here? You don't even understand the half of it," he sneered. "I did what I had to do to keep this town from falling apart. The people here," he paused, a flash of something flickering in his eyes, something like guilt, but he quickly covered it. "They needed someone to blame, and you were the perfect target. You were weak, and you were alone." Eleanor clenched her fists, but she held her ground. She had to stay calm. She had to make him admit everything. "You've been hiding behind this town's name for years," she said. "It's time for you to face the truth. You let the people here believe I was guilty when you knew I wasn't. You've been stealing, lying, and manipulating everyone. It's time to pay for what you've done." The sheriff's face twisted into a cold smile. "You really think you can bring me down? You and your little friends? Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" "We know exactly who we're messing with," John replied, his voice low and steady. "And we're not going anywhere until the truth is out." A tense silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything they had just uncovered. Eleanor's hands were still trembling, but she didn't let it show. She had come too far to back down now. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" The sheriff sneered, leaning forward in his chair. "But you're just a pawn in a much bigger game. There are things at play here that you couldn't even begin to understand." John stepped forward, his gun still resting in his hand, but his eyes never leaving the sheriff. "This town's secrets are coming to light whether you like it or not. Your little empire is crumbling, Ray. You've had your run, but it's over." The sheriff's expression darkened. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to stand, to lunge at them in some desperate attempt to regain control, but instead, he slumped back in his chair. "You won't win," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "I've got too many people in my pocket. Too many ways to make sure nothing changes." "We'll see about that," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You can't control everything. Not anymore." Eleanor could feel the power shifting in the room. The sheriff, who had once seemed so untouchable, now seemed like a man on the edge of losing everything. It was clear now. He had underestimated them, all of them. "This town deserves to know the truth," Eleanor said, her voice resolute. "And it will. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone you've hurt, everyone you've manipulated." The sheriff's eyes flickered with something like fear, but he quickly masked it with anger. "You won't get away with this," he spat. But John was already moving. "The truth is already out," he said. "We've got the evidence. You can't cover it up anymore." For the first time in what seemed like forever, Eleanor felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. They were winning. And no matter what came next, the truth was finally coming for the sheriff. The sheriff slumped in his chair, his eyes darting between the three of them, trying to gauge his options. The arrogance that had once defined him now seemed to drain away, leaving behind only the remnants of fear and realization. Eleanor could feel the shift in the air, the heaviness of the moment pressing in on them all. For the first time, the power had moved away from him. He was no longer in control. The walls he had built around himself, the secrets he had hidden, were starting to crack, and the truth was seeping through. John stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the sheriff. "It's over, Ray," John said calmly. "The people are going to know everything. And when they do, they'll want justice." The sheriff's face twisted with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you can just waltz in here and expose everything?" He spat. "You think you can turn the entire town against me?" John didn't flinch. "I don't need to turn anyone. The truth does that all on its own." Eleanor felt a rush of emotion. She had waited so long for this moment, and now it was here. She was finally going to see justice done, finally going to clear her name. But even with the sheriff on the brink of being exposed, she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. He still had power. He still had men in the town who would defend him, who would fight to keep their secrets safe. "You'll never get away with this," the sheriff muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I've already made sure of that." But Eleanor wasn't listening to him anymore. Her mind was focused on something else, on the papers they had taken from the cabin, on the evidence they had gathered. The sheriff's words no longer mattered. The truth was already in motion. "We've got everything we need," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You won't be able to cover it up anymore." Sarah stepped forward, her face hardened with resolve. "We'll make sure of it. The town deserves to know what you've been hiding, Sheriff." The sheriff's gaze flickered, his lips curling into a snarl. "You think the people will care?" he sneered. "They'll never believe you. They'll never believe a group of outlaws and criminals over me. I've been here too long." John's voice was sharp, cutting through the sheriff's bravado. "It's not about them believing us. It's about them seeing the truth for themselves. And when they do, they won't have a choice." There was a brief silence as the sheriff processed the weight of their words. He looked at the three of them, and for a moment, Eleanor could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. His power was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. His influence over the town, over the people who had once trusted him, was crumbling. The sheriff pushed himself out of his chair with a grunt, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won?" he spat, taking a step toward them. "This is just the beginning. You don't know what you've started. You're all fools." John didn't flinch as the sheriff advanced. "We know exactly what we've started," he said quietly. "We've started the end of your reign." The sheriff's fist clenched at his side, and for a moment, it looked like he might try to make a move, to do something desperate. But Eleanor could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew he was cornered. He knew there was nowhere left to run. "You've been hiding behind your badge for too long," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions. It's time for you to pay for what you've done to me, to the town, to everyone you've betrayed." The sheriff's face darkened, but for the first time, there was no defiance in his posture. There was only the crushing weight of inevitability. The truth had caught up with him, and he knew it. "You'll regret this," he growled, but there was no conviction in his voice. The three of them stood there, watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. Eleanor could feel the tension in the air, the finality of the moment hanging over them. She had come so far, fought so hard to get to this point. She wouldn't back down now. John gave a small nod, signaling for them to move. "It's done," he said, his voice final. "Let's get the evidence to the people who can do something about it." With one last glance at the sheriff, they turned and made their way to the door. But before they could leave, the sheriff's voice stopped them. "You think the truth will set you free?" he called, his voice thick with bitterness. "The truth is a weapon, and you've just unleashed it on yourselves. You're all dead. All of you." Eleanor turned back, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. "You've already lost," she said, her voice unwavering. "The truth is already here, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The sheriff said nothing more as they walked out the door. He was beaten, cornered, and he knew it. The fight was over. The truth had won, and Eleanor could finally breathe, knowing that the weight of the lies that had haunted her for so long would soon be lifted. The weight of the moment settled heavily on Eleanor's chest as she, John, and Sarah stood in the sheriff's office, watching the door close behind them. Outside, the quiet of the night had returned, but the air was thick with the tension of what was to come. Eleanor's heart was still racing, but now there was a flicker of hope in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in what seemed like forever. The truth was out, and the lies that had been built around her were finally crumbling. But even as they walked away from the sheriff's office, Eleanor knew the battle was far from over. They still had to make sure the town knew everything. They still had to expose every secret, every betrayal. She had spent so much of her life living in the shadow of those lies that now, standing in the light of truth, she felt almost unrecognizable. They made their way through the darkened streets, their footsteps muffled by the heavy silence that hung over the town. Eleanor felt as though she were walking through a dream, the events of the last few days a blur of confusion and adrenaline. But now, she had a clear path forward. They would go to the townspeople. They would show them the truth, and they would make sure the sheriff's reign of terror was over. "We're close," John said, his voice low but resolute. Eleanor nodded, her mind focused on the task ahead. She could feel the weight of the evidence they carried, the papers, the records, the proof of the sheriff's corruption. It was all in their hands now. Once we present this to the town, there's no turning back, Sarah said, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. They'll have to believe us. They'll have to face the truth. Eleanor knew that Sarah was right. Once the truth was out, there was no way for the townspeople to ignore it. But even as she walked beside them, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the town turn on the sheriff? Or would they try to protect him, blinded by their loyalty to the man who had led them for so long? As they reached the center of town, Eleanor stopped for a moment, looking around at the familiar buildings, the houses, the storefronts. Everything looked the same, but she knew it wasn't. The town was about to change forever. This is it, John said, breaking her thoughts. We do this now. We show them everything. Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation ahead. They walked to the town square, where a small group of people had gathered outside the general store. The air was thick with the low murmur of voices, and for a moment, Eleanor's nerves flared up again. She wanted to hide, to run, but she couldn't. Not now. She stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. Everyone needs to hear this, she said, her words carrying across the small gathering. You've been lied to, and the man who's been leading this town for years has been hiding the truth from you. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Eleanor could see the confusion and skepticism on their faces. She turned to John, who stepped forward and began to lay out the evidence they had uncovered, the sheriff's corruption, his role in framing her, the secrets he had been hiding. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief, others looking uneasy. But Eleanor could feel the shift. She could feel the power of the truth working its way into the hearts and minds of the townspeople. As John finished explaining, there was a long silence. Then one voice spoke up. Is this true? It was an older man, one who had lived in the town for as long as Eleanor could remember. She recognized the skepticism in his voice, the doubt that had been planted in everyone's minds by the sheriff. But now, it seemed like the seed of doubt was beginning to sprout in the others as well. Eleanor stepped forward, holding up the papers they had found in the cabin. This is the truth, she said, her voice strong and unwavering. We have the evidence to prove it. The sheriff is guilty, and it's time for him to face justice. The crowd fell silent again, but this time, there was a shift. Eleanor could see it in their eyes. There was no longer a veil of unquestioning loyalty to the sheriff. The truth had made its mark. A few of the townspeople looked at each other, as if exchanging unspoken words, while others turned away, clearly disturbed by what they were hearing. But the doubt was there. The seeds of change had been planted. What now? Sarah asked quietly, standing beside Eleanor. John looked at her, his eyes calm but filled with a quiet resolve. Now, we make sure the sheriff can't hide anymore. We go to the others, those who were too afraid to speak out, and we show them the truth. And then we make sure this town knows who he really is. Eleanor nodded, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of purpose. They had come this far. They had uncovered the truth, and now they would make sure the town couldn't ignore it. We do this together, she said, her voice steady. And we make sure no one ever has to suffer the way I did again. As they walked away from the square, Eleanor felt a weight lifting from her chest. The battle wasn't over, but they had made a start. The truth had been set in motion, and nothing would stop it now. The town would never be the same again, and neither would she. The following day, the atmosphere in Lincoln Springs was thick with uncertainty. Eleanor, John, and Sarah had spent the night preparing for what was to come. The truth about Sheriff Ray Collins was now known by the townspeople, but it wasn't enough. The sheriff's power had not been broken yet. There were still those who stood by him, and the town had to decide what it would do with the truth. As they walked through the town square that morning, Eleanor could feel the eyes of the people on her, some of them wary, others filled with suspicion. They hadn't been able to change everything overnight, but now they had to push for the final step. They had to make sure the sheriff could no longer control the narrative, and that justice would be served. The town hall was crowded, the air buzzing with murmurs. A few of the townsfolk stood by the sheriff, their faces set in defiance, but many others seemed to be wavering, unsure of where to stand now that the truth was out. It was a critical moment. If they acted now, they could strip away the sheriff's influence. If they hesitated, the town might fall back under his sway. It's time, John said, his voice low as he surveyed the room. He had always been the one to act, the one who had been prepared to confront the sheriff head-on, and now the moment was finally here. Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath as she stepped forward, her heart pounding. "We have the evidence," she said, her voice strong and steady. "We have everything you need to see the truth about Sheriff Ray Collins." The room fell silent, every eye turning toward her. Eleanor felt the weight of the moment, the pressure to convince them, but she knew she couldn't back down now. She had to stand firm, for herself, and for everyone the sheriff had hurt. John stepped up. Beside her, his presence solid and unyielding. "We've uncovered everything," he said. "The sheriff's involvement in the theft, the lies he told, and how he manipulated this town for years. We have the papers, we have the proof. You can't deny it any longer." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked uneasy, others angry, and a few seemed to consider the weight of what they were hearing. But one voice broke through the tension. "This is all lies." It was Tom Walker, a local businessman who had been one of the sheriff's most vocal supporters. "This is nothing but an attack on everything this town stands for." "No, Tom," Sarah said, her voice firm as she stepped forward. "It's an attack on corruption, on the lies we've all been forced to live with. The sheriff has used his power to control all of us, and we've allowed it for too long." Tom's face reddened as he stepped closer to Sarah. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, but the anger in his voice was less certain now. "You don't know what's been at stake, what we've had to do to survive in this town." "I know exactly what we've had to do," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I know what it feels like to be blamed for something I didn't do, to be treated like a criminal for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The sheriff has lied to all of you, and we're not going to let him get away with it." For a moment, the room was still. Eleanor could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her, some of them filled with doubt, others with growing conviction. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to speak up. "It's true," a woman called out from the back of the room. "I've seen the evidence. I've heard the rumors. We've all known something wasn't right, but we were too afraid to say it." Another man stood up, his face somber. "I've heard enough to know the truth. We can't keep living in fear." Eleanor felt the tide beginning to turn. The sheriff's hold on the town was weakening, and she knew that this was the moment that would define everything. "We can't undo what's been done," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "But we can make sure it doesn't happen again. We can make sure that the sheriff faces justice for his crimes, and that this town is finally free from his lies." The crowd was quiet now, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. Tom Walker opened his mouth to protest, but no one was listening anymore. Eleanor could see it in their eyes. The truth had taken root, and it was spreading. One by one, people started standing up, their voices rising in support. "We'll take the evidence to the authorities," John said, his voice strong. "We'll make sure the sheriff is held accountable for everything he's done. And we'll rebuild," Sarah added. "We'll rebuild this town, and we'll do it together. No more fear. No more lies." The sheriff's supporters, those who had clung to his power out of fear or loyalty, slowly began to back away, their expressions uncertain. The room was filled with a quiet sense of change, of something new taking root. Eleanor felt the weight on her shoulders lifting. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe freely. The truth had won. The sheriff's reign was over. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice breaking through the silence. "Thank you for believing in the truth. Thank you for standing with us." The townspeople were no longer just looking at her. They were looking at each other, at what they could rebuild together. They had faced the darkness, and now they were moving into the light. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Eleanor had spent so long in the shadow of fear and doubt that now, as the truth spread throughout Lincoln Springs, it felt almost surreal. The townspeople who had once avoided her or whispered behind her back now approached her with open expressions, some with apologies, others with gratitude. The sheriff had been arrested, his reign of terror officially ended. The evidence they had gathered was enough to bring him down, and the town council had promised to hold a formal trial to ensure justice was fully served. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like an end. It felt like the beginning of something else. Eleanor walked through the town square one morning, her steps slower than usual, but her head held high. The sun was shining brighter now, almost as though the weight of the past few years had been lifted. But as she walked, she couldn't help but feel a small pang of loss. The people who had once been her friends, those who had shunned her, those who had stood by the sheriff, were now suddenly looking at her with new eyes. She wasn't sure if it was pity or genuine remorse, but the shift was undeniable. She had been a victim of lies, but in the end, she was the one who had come out of it stronger. She looked over to the general store, where a small crowd had gathered, some talking in hushed tones, others watching her with curiosity. The storekeeper, a kind woman named Clara, waved her over. "Eleanor," Clara called, her voice warm. "I've got something for you." Eleanor smiled and walked over, a small knot of nervousness twisting in her stomach. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing the small wrapped package in Clara's hands. Clara grinned as she handed it over. "It's a little something. A thank you for standing up for what's right." Eleanor took the package, carefully unwrapping it. Inside, she found a small wooden box, finely crafted with intricate designs etched into the surface. It was beautiful. "I don't know what to say," Eleanor said softly, touched by the gesture. "You don't have to say anything," Clara replied. "It's just, we've all been through a lot, and you've reminded us that the truth matters. That we can't let fear control us anymore." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. It was hard to put into words how much it meant to her to finally be seen, to finally be heard. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than you know." As she walked away from the general store, the feeling of loss that had lingered in her chest began to fade. It wasn't just the sheriff's fall from power that had changed everything. It was the town itself, its people, its spirit. It wasn't perfect, and it would take time to heal, but they had taken the first step toward redemption. And she had, too. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. As she continued down the street, Eleanor saw Sarah standing near the town hall, talking to a few people who had gathered around. She smiled at Eleanor, and there was something in her eyes, something that mirrored what Eleanor felt inside. The town was changing, and they were part of that change. "You look different," Sarah said as Eleanor approached. "I feel different," Eleanor replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I didn't realize how heavy the weight of the past was until it was gone." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "You've carried it for so long. But now, you don't have to anymore." Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of her past no longer pressing on her shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. They had faced down the darkness together, and now they could start to rebuild. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about standing up for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been wronged. "So what now?" Eleanor asked, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. Sarah gave a small shrug. "Now, we take it one day at a time. We make sure the sheriff's trial is fair, and we keep fighting for what's right." Eleanor nodded. She was ready. Ready to live, ready to fight for the town she called home, and ready to finally embrace the future she had once thought was lost. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with the truth on her side and the town slowly coming together, she knew they would be able to face whatever came next. The sky above was a brilliant blue, the promise of new beginnings stretching before her. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt at peace. The trial of Sheriff Ray Collins was set for the following week, and the town was already buzzing with tension. Eleanor had thought that once the truth was out, things would calm down, but the reality was far different. The town was divided. Some believed the sheriff's actions had been justified, that he had been a necessary figure to keep order. Others were ready for change, eager to see the town rebuild from the ashes of the corruption they had just uncovered. Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Even with the sheriff in custody, the town was still filled with people who were loyal to him, people who had benefited from his reign of manipulation. As she walked through the streets, she could see the unease in their eyes, the way they glanced over their shoulders, uncertain of what the future would hold. But the air was different now, heavier with the weight of change. The townspeople had tasted the truth, and it was impossible to ignore. Eleanor walked with purpose, her head held high, but her heart still weighed down by the uncertainty of what was to come. As she reached the town square, she saw Sarah standing near the fountain, talking to a small group of people. When Sarah saw Eleanor, she waved her over. "How's it going?" Sarah asked, her tone warm but cautious. Eleanor smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a lot. The town's still divided, and I can feel the tension in the air. Everyone's watching, waiting to see what will happen at the trial." Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. It's not going to be easy. There are people here who've lived with the sheriff's rule for a long time. They're not going to give it up easily. Eleanor glanced around, noticing a few familiar faces lingering nearby. Some of the townsfolk had started to approach her more openly, offering nods of acknowledgement or hesitant smiles. Others still looked at her with distrust, unsure if they could trust the woman who had been the sheriff's target. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We keep pushing for the truth," Sarah replied. "We make sure the trial is fair, and we make sure the sheriff is held accountable for everything he's done. We don't let up." Eleanor nodded. She had come too far to back down now. The sheriff's trial was the final piece of the puzzle. It would determine whether the town would remain under the shadow of the sheriff's lies or whether they would break free and rebuild. As they spoke, a group of people gathered in the square, led by Clara, the storekeeper. Clara stepped forward, her face filled with resolve. "We need to come together," Clara said, her voice strong. "We've been living under the sheriff's thumb for too long. Now's our chance to make things right." Eleanor could see the determination in Clara's eyes, and she knew this was a pivotal moment. The town was no longer just divided by loyalty to the sheriff. It was divided by those who wanted change and those who wanted to hold on to the past. "What can we do?" Eleanor asked, stepping closer. Clara smiled, though it was tempered by the weight of the situation. "We need to support each other. We need to stand together when the trial begins. The more of us who show up and speak out, the stronger our case will be." Eleanor felt a surge of resolve. "I'll be there," she said, her voice unwavering. "We'll all be there. We won't let the truth be buried again." Sarah stepped forward as well, her eyes fierce with determination. "This town deserves better than the lies we've lived with for so long. We're not just fighting for Eleanor. We're fighting for everyone who's been silenced, for everyone who's been wronged." The group nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they couldn't go back to the way things had been. As the trial drew nearer, Eleanor's thoughts often turned to the sheriff. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen to him when the truth came out in full. Would he be stripped of everything he had worked so hard to protect? Would the town truly embrace change, or would it cling to the past? The night before the trial, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her small room, the events of the past few days replaying in her mind. The sheriff's arrest, the people turning against him, the hope that had begun to take root in the town. It was all so surreal. She had been living with the weight of her past for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to live without it. But now, she was moving forward. The truth was out. The sheriff's lies had been exposed, and she would see it through to the end. At dawn, Eleanor made her way to the courthouse, where the trial was to take place. The streets were quieter than usual, the tension thick in the air. As she walked, she saw the familiar faces of the townsfolk, each one weighed down by their own thoughts. Some were nervous, others were hopeful, but all of them knew that this trial would shape the future of their town. As she reached the courthouse steps, Eleanor turned to Sarah, who was standing beside her. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked quietly. Eleanor looked around at the people who had gathered, their faces a mix of uncertainty and anticipation. "I'm ready," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "It's time to let the truth speak for itself." Together, they walked up the steps, knowing that the next few hours would determine everything. The future of the town, and their own lives, depended on it. The trial of Sheriff Ray Collins was a turning point for Lincoln Springs. As the trial went on, the weight of truth became undeniable. The town's inhabitants, who had once lived in the shadow of fear and corruption, now found themselves faced with the task of choosing a new path forward. Eleanor, John, and Sarah sat in the back of the crowded courthouse, watching as the town's residents slowly began to speak up. It wasn't just about the sheriff anymore. It was about reclaiming the town for themselves. As the trial reached its final stages, Eleanor could feel the air in the room change. The evidence had been presented. The sheriff's lies had been exposed for all to see. And now, it was up to the people of Lincoln Springs to decide his fate. When it came time for the townsfolk to speak, one by one, they stood and gave their accounts. Some spoke of the fear that had gripped them, how they had been afraid to speak out, even when they knew something wasn't right. Others told stories of how the sheriff had manipulated them, used them to cover up his crimes, and silenced those who dared to question him. It was raw, it was honest, and it was the truth. Eleanor listened to every word, her heart heavy with the realization that the sheriff's grip on the town had been stronger than she had ever imagined. But as more and more people stood to speak, she began to feel something else, a sense of hope. The people of Lincoln Springs were ready for change. They had been living in fear for too long, and now they were ready to take back their town. When it was finally Eleanor's turn, she stood and walked to the front of the room, the weight of all those eyes on her. For a moment, she felt the familiar sting of doubt, but she quickly pushed it aside. This was her moment to finally speak the truth, to let everyone know that she had never been guilty, and to make sure the sheriff couldn't hurt anyone else. "I've lived with the weight of these lies for too long," Eleanor began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been blamed for something I didn't do. I was used as a scapegoat, and I've carried that burden every day. But it's not just about me. It's about all of you, about the town we've all lived in, the town that's been manipulated, the town that's been kept in the dark. We deserve better than this." She paused for a moment, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had once shunned her, and the ones who had believed in the sheriff's lies. "The truth isn't always easy to face," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But we can't keep living in fear. We can't keep hiding from the truth. If we want to rebuild this town, we have to do it together. We have to face what's been done and make sure it never happens again." The room was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, the people of Lincoln Springs began to stand and voice their support. It wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It was about the town, about rebuilding what had been broken, about reclaiming their community from the grip of fear and corruption. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, the verdict was clear. Sheriff Ray Collins was guilty of everything they had accused him of. The town had spoken. The truth had won. Eleanor, John, and Sarah stood together in the courthouse as the sheriff was taken into custody. There were no cheers, no loud celebrations. It wasn't a victory that could be shouted from the rooftops. It was a quiet, steady victory, one that would take time to heal, but it was a victory nonetheless. As they walked out of the courthouse, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The burden she had carried for so long had finally been released. She looked around at the people of the town, some of them still uncertain, others filled with resolve. It wouldn't be easy to rebuild, but at least now they had the chance. Eleanor knew it would take time to heal the wounds the sheriff had caused, but she was ready. She was ready to help rebuild a town that had once abandoned her, to help them find their way back to the truth. As the sun began to set over Lincoln Springs, Eleanor stood with John and Sarah, watching the horizon. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt hopeful. She had faced down the darkness, and now she was ready to step into the light. The truth had set her free, and it had set the town free as well. They had fought for what was right, and together they would rebuild.